The Sochi conference in October 2025 was meant to be a celebration of resilience. Under the grand chandeliers of the Black Sea resort, Vladimir Putin stood before a crowd of ministers, generals, and state media representatives declaring that Russia had withstood the most powerful external pressure in world history. 30,000 sanctions, he said, had only made the country stronger. Yet behind the applause and choreographed patriotism, the numbers told a different story. Industrial output was falling, oil revenues were shrinking, and foreign reserves were evaporating at a rate unseen since the 1998 ruble crisis. Putin's speech was not a message to the West. It was a performance for a domestic audience living through quiet panic. Across Russia, the reality of economic decay was beginning to seep into everyday life. The price of groceries had tripled. In some regions, auto sales had collapsed, and the ruble had lost nearly half its value since the start of the year. According to Bloomberg's October 2025 economic outlook, Russia's GDP had contracted by more than 8% over the previous 12 months. Even as Kremlin-controlled media continued to broadcast triumphalist slogans about import substitution and economic sovereignty, but the facade was cracking. Even state-owned banks began to warn of insolvency in key industrial sectors, while the Central Bank of Russia quietly suspended public reporting of its gold reserves. Putin's insistence that the world cannot exist without Russia sounded less like confidence and more like defiance. Beneath the rhetoric lay desperation. A leader who had built his empire on control was now losing control of his own economy. In the social perspective, what was unfolding was not just an economic crisis, but a social fracture. Moscow and St. Petersburg, home to Russia's political elite, remained insulated from the worst effects. But in the provinces from Buryatia to Dagestan, the cost of Putin's war economy was devastating. In these regions, families already burdened by poverty and unemployment were now losing sons to the front lines. While the Kremlin bragged about resilience, the countryside was paying in blood. Reports from Novaya Gazeta Europe revealed that some rural districts had casualty rates nearly 12 times higher than in the capital. "Our children are gone," said a grieving mother from Ulan-Ude. "Moscow sends the orders, we send the bodies." Putin's illusion of prosperity also depended on fear. The regime's control over television, newspapers, and the internet was absolute, or so it appeared. Yet even here, cracks were visible. Telegram channels run by small independent journalists began circulating leaked statistics from the Ministry of Finance, showing that military spending now consumed more than 40% of the federal budget. Inflation in essential goods was running at 19%, nearly double the official figure. And while the Kremlin continued to tout record oil exports, those exports were increasingly unprofitable, with Western sanctions forcing Moscow to sell crude at discounts exceeding $30 per barrel. International analysts from Reuters and the Financial Times began calling it Russia's shadow recession. The economy still moved, but only through state coercion, forced labor extensions, asset seizures, and emergency decrees. Every ruble earned by private enterprise was now seen as potential fuel for the Kremlin's war machine. The political perspective revealed a subtler struggle. Inside ministries, bureaucrats whispered about the silent purges of mid-level officials accused of economic sabotage. Business owners, once protected by Kremlin connections, were suddenly targets. Putin's televised confidence masked a campaign of confiscations that would soon sweep across the oligarch class. In the corridors of power, one phrase began circulating: stabilization through fear. It was an old Soviet tactic, reborn in digital form, maintaining loyalty by making everyone afraid of losing everything. Putin's Sochi speech closed with a declaration that Russia's strength lies in its unity. But the applause that followed was thin and forced. Outside the conference hall, the Black Sea breeze carried a hint of irony. A nation that once boasted of its energy dominance was running out of fuel, literally and figuratively. The illusion of resilience had served its purpose for the cameras. But among the Russian elite, the question was already being whispered. How long could this illusion hold before the system itself began to devour its own creators? The answer would soon emerge in the next phase of Putin's strategy, a desperate move that turned his own billionaires into prey. When Vladimir Putin began seizing the assets of Russia's wealthiest oligarchs in mid-2025, the move was presented as patriotic duty. The Kremlin's legal filings described it as a reallocation of national wealth in wartime conditions. But for those inside Russia's business elite, it was a declaration of war not against the West, but against themselves. The target list read like a who's who of Putin's inner circle energy tycoons, real estate magnates, industrialists who had financed his political rise. According to the Moscow Times, more than $55 billion in private holdings had been nationalized or transferred to state trusteeship since June. Officially, these seizures were justified on grounds of foreign collusion or economic disloyalty. In reality, it was about one thing: cash flow. The Kremlin's war machine was starving. With oil profits collapsing and sanctions choking access to Western capital markets, Putin had turned inward for funding. This was the new stage of economic cannibalism. Once the oligarchs had been symbols of stability, now they were scapegoats. Their yachts, villas, and factories became propaganda tools. Each televised arrest, each televised confiscation order was broadcast as proof that Putin was defending the common man against the corrupt elite. Yet in the social perspective, this theater only deepened Russia's internal inequalities. For the working class in provincial Russia, nothing changed. Prices still climbed, salaries still stagnated, and funeral notices still arrived from the front. What changed was ownership. Factories that once provided local jobs were now folded into opaque state corporations managed by security officials. In Buryatia, the takeover of a mining company led to mass layoffs under the pretext of restructuring. In Dagestan, small traders reported new patriotic taxes enforced by regional governors desperate to fill federal quotas. "We are the ones paying," one shop owner told BBC Russian service. "They seize the rich, but the bill comes to us." The seizures also exposed the political perspective, the cracks in Putin's control. Some oligarchs tried to resist through quiet lobbying, others fled. But for the first time in decades, the Kremlin faced pushback not from the opposition, but from its own financiers. Anonymous Telegram channels linked to the business community began circulating warnings: no one is safe. Your wealth today could be national property tomorrow. One particularly striking leak published by Medusa quoted a senior banker saying, "He built us, and now he's dismantling us one by one." Putin's strategy mirrored Stalin's late 1930s purge logic: destroy the economic elite to consolidate political loyalty. But in a globalized 2025 economy, this came with higher costs. Western analysts at Defense News noted that while the Kremlin temporarily gained liquid assets, it lost managerial expertise and access to critical technology. When state security officials replaced experienced executives, production in several energy sectors dropped by 17% within months. The Kremlin, of course, denied any such impact. In public, Putin claimed these seizures were proof that Russian capitalism serves the people. Behind closed doors, however, the panic was evident. Emergency meetings at the Ministry of Finance discussed how to convert confiscated assets into usable state revenue. Much of the seized wealth, luxury real estate, frozen offshore accounts, and equity in Western-sanctioned companies was illiquid. As Reuters reported, the government was effectively trying to fund a war with non-spendable trophies. From a demographic perspective, the implications were even darker. The business exodus triggered by these seizures accelerated a wave of silent emigration. Over 400,000 professionals, including IT workers, engineers, and financiers, left Russia between March and October 2025, according to independent watchdog OK Russians. This brain drain was stripping away the very strata of society capable of rebuilding the post-war economy. They are eating their future, said economist Vladislav Inozemtsev. Once these people are gone, they will not return. Within Russia, the propaganda continued. State TV framed the oligarch seizures as economic patriotism, showing images of newly nationalized factories with flags flying above their gates. But the workers inside those factories told a different story. Shorter shifts, delayed wages, broken machinery, and no raw materials. By autumn, even loyal businessmen like Andrei Kostin of VTB Bank began hinting publicly that extraordinary measures were needed to prevent financial collapse. The irony was impossible to miss. The very system that Putin built to enrich loyalty was now consuming itself in order to survive. And still, the president doubled down. The Russian state must remain sovereign over all its resources, he declared in a September address. But as experts warned, sovereignty achieved through confiscation is just another word for desperation. The purge of the oligarchs might have filled a few short-term budget gaps, but it unleashed a long-term crisis of confidence. Investors went silent. Domestic credit froze. Fear became the new currency of Moscow's elite. And as the Kremlin tightened its grip, the country's once mighty energy empire began to falter. Setting the stage for an even more humiliating revelation, Russia, the so-called gas station of the world, was running on imported fuel. By late 2025, the unthinkable had happened. Russia, once the energy powerhouse of Europe, was importing refined fuel from China. The news broke quietly at first, through leaked trade manifests reviewed by Reuters and defense news shipments of diesel and gasoline moving east to west, crossing the Amur River into Russian territory. It was a geopolitical irony of historic proportions. The self-proclaimed gas station of the world was now buying the very products it once supplied to half the planet. The reason was straightforward, but devastating. Ukrainian drone and missile strikes had crippled roughly 40% of Russia's oil refining capacity. Facilities in Ryazan-Omsk and Volgograd were hit multiple times throughout the summer, setting off infernos that burned for days. Satellite imagery analyzed by BBC Verify showed blackened refinery complexes stretching for kilometers, physical proof of a war that had reached deep into Russia's industrial heart. But the consequences went far beyond fire and smoke. With refineries offline, Russia was forced to sell more crude oil at steep discounts, while simultaneously importing higher-value refined products. This reversed the economic logic that had funded the Kremlin for 2 decades. It's like a bakery selling flour and buying bread, quipped one energy analyst in the Financial Times. The Ministry of Energy tried to downplay the damage, but leaked budget figures revealed a sharp 30% drop in net oil revenue. To sustain domestic supply, Moscow turned to its new strategic partner, Beijing. But the arrangement came at a humiliating cost. China demanded payment in yuan and secured long-term price discounts that effectively turned Russia into a vassal supplier. Even Kremlin insiders began referring to it privately as energy serfdom. Yet Putin publicly spun it as proof of Russia's pivot to Asia. The political perspective here was striking. Putin's attempt to bypass Western sanctions had made Russia more dependent on China than ever before. For all his rhetoric about multipolarity, Moscow now found itself locked in a one-sided relationship, exporting crude at minimal profit, while importing refined fuels at premium rates. In essence, Russia had swapped one master for another. Inside Russia, the crisis trickled down to ordinary life. Gasoline prices spiked 18% in provincial regions, forcing public transport fares up and delivery services to shut down. Truckers from Siberia to Rostov began staging micro-protests, blocking highways in frustration. These were not political activists. They were ordinary workers, angry and broke. Videos shared on Telegram showed drivers chanting, "We cannot feed our families," before police quickly dispersed them. These incidents never reached state television, but they echoed across digital Russia. From the social perspective, the divide between Moscow and the provinces grew sharper. In the capital, the government subsidized fuel for elite sectors, the military police, and state corporations. But in rural regions, shortages became routine. A local mayor in the Republic of Komi told Novaya Gazeta Europe that fuel allocations arrive half empty. Meanwhile, in Buryatia and Dagestan regions already bled dry by mobilization, families struggled to afford heating as winter approached. "They take our sons for war, and our fuel for export," said a resident of Makhachkala. What do we have left? The demographic perspective painted an even grimmer picture. Russia's energy crisis was accelerating an exodus of skilled labor. Tens of thousands of engineers and technicians who once worked in oil refineries and energy research centers had either fled the country or shifted to non-industrial jobs. Al Jazeera reported that nearly half of Russia's petrochemical workforce under age 40 had left for Kazakhstan, Armenia, or the UAE since 2022. This wasn't just a short-term skills gap. It was a generational loss that would cripple Russia's energy innovation for decades. Even within government circles, a quiet realization emerged: without modern refineries and Western technology, Russia's energy dominance could not recover. Sanctions had cut off essential equipment like compressors, catalysts, and control systems, all produced in Europe or the United States. Domestic replacements, hastily produced under import substitution, failed to meet efficiency standards, causing constant breakdowns. Donald Trump's White House, meanwhile, tightened the pressure further. In September 2025, the Trump administration announced Phase 4 sanctions targeting secondary buyers of Russian oil, effectively discouraging India and Turkey from expanding trade. The result was a logistical chokehold. Tankers sat idle in ports, unable to find insurers or buyers. As Russia's energy empire decayed, the Kremlin's narrative of resilience grew thinner. State TV praised strategic partnerships, while citizens queued for fuel. The situation revealed an uncomfortable truth: the Kremlin could control speech and television, but not physics. Oil still needed refineries. Economies still needed trust. By the end of the year, one question loomed large: if Russia could no longer rely on oil to fund its war, where would the money come from next? The answer lay in the hollowed-out ruins of its industrial base, where factories, car plants, and workers were being pushed to the brink of collapse. By November 2025, the collapse of Russia's industrial sector was no longer a rumor whispered on Telegram. It was visible in every factory yard, every half-empty warehouse, every silent assembly line from Tolyatti to Nizhny Novgorod. The once proud auto giant Avtovazy, the maker of Lada, had cut production days from 5 to 4, and then from 4 to 3. The Kremlin insisted this was a modern labor efficiency reform. But for the workers whose wages dropped by nearly a third, it was a euphemism for poverty. Across Russia, similar stories multiplied. Tractor plants in Chelyabinsk, aviation repair workshops in Irkutsk, and steel mills along the Volga all were scaling down operations or shutting entirely. Managers received quiet instructions not to lay off employees, since that would mar official unemployment statistics. Instead, workers were rotated on administrative leave, effectively jobless, but still counted as employed. As Reuters described it, Russia was entering a zombie economy, a system that looked alive on paper, but was hollow within. The social perspective revealed how unevenly this industrial decay hit. In Moscow and St. Petersburg, government subsidies and defense contracts kept select factories running. But in the poorer peripheries where ethnic minorities made up most of the workforce, production simply died. Regions like Buryatia, Dagestan, and Tuva, already devastated by military mobilization, now faced mass underemployment. Families that had lost sons at the front were losing their incomes at home. They promised us support for the fallen, a widow from Ulan-Ude told DW News, but even the factory that built his tank is closing. The Kremlin's propaganda tried to frame these disruptions as part of a patriotic revival. State television aired documentaries comparing Russia's new economic mobilization to the industrial efforts of World War II. The message was clear: shortages were sacrifices for victory. But the comparison only deepened resentment. This time, there was no clear enemy to defeat, only endless war and empty shelves. Underneath this crumbling economy, a political perspective was emerging that even the Kremlin struggled to contain. The wives and mothers of factory workers began quietly connecting through telegram channels originally built for soldier families. What began as exchanges about wages and working hours evolved into discussions about corruption and military casualties. The Soldiers' Mothers of Russia, a movement suppressed since the early 2000s, was quietly reawakening. Their tone was not political, but moral. "If our sons die for Russia," one mother said in a viral clip, "why can't Russia feed its own workers?" These women were difficult for the state to silence. They were not opposition figures, not foreign agents, not activists. They were the conscience of the ordinary Russian household, and the Kremlin knew it. According to BBC, Russian service regional governors received private memos warning them to engage with mothers' groups respectfully, not confrontationally. That phrase, respectfully, was rare in Russian bureaucracy, and it reflected quiet fear. As protests spread from small towns to mid-sized cities, they revealed a network of discontent that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with survival. Telegram groups like Women for Life and Mothers of Soldiers 2025 gained tens of thousands of followers. Some even coordinated silent strikes where factory workers would clock in but refuse overtime shifts, halting production without overtly breaking laws. Meanwhile, the demographic perspective grew bleaker. With every month of war, more skilled labor vanished. Russia's Ministry of Industry admitted in a closed report leaked to The Insider that the country faced a 30% shortage of qualified engineers and mechanics. The younger generation, the very people who should have replaced them, was either dead in Ukraine, disabled, or had fled abroad. "We're building an economy without youth," wrote economist Alexandra Prokopenko in Carnegie Politica. "That's not reconstruction, it's regression." Wage inflation and skill shortages drove a vicious cycle. To retain the few specialists remaining, factories had to raise salaries dramatically, sometimes by 50%. But since output continued to fall, those raises only fueled further inflation. A loaf of bread in Volgograd, which cost 50 rubles in 2023, now cost 130. And even if one could afford it, supply often ran out. By winter, Putin's sovereign economy had begun to look eerily like the late Soviet one he once criticized: empty stores, fake statistics, slogans about strength masking widespread decay. In televised speeches, he called this period a necessary purification, invoking history's darkest echoes. But for ordinary Russians, it felt like a return to the stagnation their grandparents had warned them about. Still, the president maintained that Russia's unity is unbreakable. Yet unity forged by fear was already fracturing. The people in the cities murmured about layoffs. The people in the villages buried their sons. Factories that once built cars were now producing coffins. And soon, that grim industry, death itself, would become the only sector still growing. By December 2025, Russia's fastest-growing business was no longer oil, steel, or weapons, it was funerals. The war that the Kremlin still refused to call a war had created an industry of death so vast that it was now tracked in quarterly reports. According to Kommersant and BBC Verify, Russia's funeral service sector grew by more than 13% in the first 4 months of the year, with nearly 200 new companies opening nationwide. Coffin prices rose 9%, and grave-digging costs jumped 15%. It was, as one analyst grimly put it, the only area of guaranteed demand. State media avoided using the word boom, but the numbers spoke louder than propaganda. The country's mortuaries were running 24-hour shifts. Refrigerated trucks lined the outskirts of military towns in Belgorod and Kursk. Crematoriums in Samara and Rostov reported technical overload. One Moscow advertising agency even created billboards for a coffin company featuring smiling models and the slogan, "Rest beautifully forever." It was grotesque yet symbolic of the cynical capitalism that now thrived under Putin's special military operation. Behind the statistics lay a deeper social tragedy. The social perspective exposed how Russia's poorest regions bore the full weight of this death economy. In Moscow and St. Petersburg, war casualties remained low thanks to the Kremlin's policy of shielding the elite centers from mobilization. But in the ethnic republics, Buryatia, Dagestan, Tuva, and Bashkortostan, the toll was catastrophic. Reuters data analysis in late 2025 showed that per capita deaths from the front lines were up to 12 times higher in these regions than in the capital. "Our men are gone, our villages are empty," a teacher from Kaysal told Al Jazeera. "They say it's for the motherland, but whose motherland we only bury." The Kremlin's silence on this disparity has become a national wound. Moscow's TV channels broadcast images of medals, parades, and heroes returning home. But in the villages, the only returning presence was grief. Every funeral became a political act, every coffin a reminder that the war was devouring Russia's most marginalized. In the remote Siberian settlement of Gusinuzersk, locals began planting small wooden crosses along the highway for every soldier lost. By autumn, there were hundreds. The political perspective sharpened as these deaths turned personal. The soldiers' mothers' movement, once crushed by state security, began to rise again, not as a political opposition, but as a collective conscience. Wives and mothers started using encrypted telegram channels to track casualty lists the government refused to publish. These lists circulated widely, sometimes containing names that contradicted official denials. When a group of mothers from Dagestan tried to lay flowers outside a local administration building, riot police arrived, but hesitated. Cameras were rolling. The footage went viral within hours. The Kremlin faced a dilemma it had not encountered in years: how to suppress grief without appearing monstrous. "Women cannot be treated like protesters," a senior regional official told Meduza. But they are becoming protesters without even realizing it. The government's answer was half-hearted appeasement. In early October, Putin signed a decree offering enhanced compensation to families of the fallen, along with a promise of free housing for widows. Yet these payments, often delayed for months, only reinforced resentment. "They think we can be bought," said one mother. But money doesn't raise the dead. From the demographic perspective, the numbers were staggering. The Economist estimated that Russia had lost more than 1 million troops killed or permanently injured by the end of 2025. Half of those were under 35. In a nation already facing one of the lowest birth rates in Europe, this was demographic suicide. Economists called it the lost decade before it even began. Rural communities were becoming gender-skewed entire villages where women outnumbered men 5 to 1. The long-term implications went beyond the battlefield, shrinking labor forces, collapsing family structures, and an aging population that the state could no longer afford to support. As these losses mounted, Putin continued to project calm confidence. Every generation of Russians faces trials, he said in a televised address from the Kremlin. We endure, we prevail, we win. But his words sounded hollow against the backdrop of funerals televised across the provinces. In Dagestan, a group of mothers carried a banner reading, "How many more victories will kill us?" The banner was quickly torn down by police, but not before images of it spread across social media. Meanwhile, inside Russia's cities, another group was quietly counting its dead undertakers, coffin makers, and gravediggers. Some joked darkly that theirs was the only recession-proof profession left. Yet beneath the black humor, fear was spreading. Even those profiting from the war understood the truth: no nation can sustain itself on death alone. And as the factories of life shut down and the machinery of death accelerated, a more profound collapse began, not of industry or ideology, but of intellect and future. Russia's real crisis, analysts warned, would not be measured in rubles or soldiers, but in brains. By early 2026, it was no longer soldiers or oligarchs leaving Russia, it was its future. The most devastating consequence of Putin's war was not the loss of land or money, but the loss of minds. Across Moscow's airports, train stations, and border crossings, a quiet exodus continued. Engineers, IT specialists, scientists, economists, and teachers, those who once formed the intellectual backbone of the country, were disappearing. According to Reuters and Le Monde, more than 1.3 million skilled professionals had left Russia since the invasion of Ukraine began, and the numbers surged again after the oligarch seizures and refinery failures of 2025. The demographic perspective called it the second wave of national extinction. Unlike the first, which claimed lives in trenches, this one hollowed out the country's brain. Economists described it as double bleeding, the simultaneous loss of youth to war and intellect to emigration. The central bank quietly admitted that the labor shortage had reached crisis levels, with 3.5 million unfilled skilled positions nationwide. The consequences rippled across every sector. Defense production slowed, technology projects stalled, hospitals faced shortages of doctors, and universities hemorrhaged faculty. For the Kremlin, this flight represented a subtle rebellion, one harder to suppress than protests. Those leaving did not chant slogans or wave flags. They simply walked away. Every programmer who leaves is one less missile guidance system, said analyst Andrei Movchan. Every engineer who goes to Armenia takes a piece of Russia's future with him. Western nations like Germany, Poland, and the Czech Republic reported record applications from Russian professionals seeking residency. Ironically, these same countries had once been portrayed by Kremlin media as Russia's enemies. The political perspective revealed that this brain drain was not merely accidental, it was strategic neglect. The Kremlin's obsession with loyalty over competence had created a system that punished intelligence. Those who questioned the war even privately faced surveillance, job loss, or worse. Universities introduced loyalty oaths. Science academies were forced to include patriotic statements in their research funding applications. In today's Russia, you can't build a robot without first praising the motherland, a Moscow engineer told BBC Russian service. In this climate, even patriotism began to sound performative. State television broadcast stories of heroic scientists who stayed to help the nation survive sanctions, but insiders described empty laboratories, broken equipment, and unpaid wages. The country's technological core was eroding, and with it the promise of modernity that Putin had once used to legitimize his rule. He is rebuilding the past, not the future, wrote columnist Yevgeny Kiselyov. And in that past, There is no innovation, only obedience. From the social perspective, the war's human inequality became unbearable. In 2025, Russia's Federal Statistics Service reported the lowest fertility rate in its recorded history, 1.2 children per woman. In the regions hardest hit by mobilization, Buryatia, Dagestan, and Tuva, the numbers were even lower. These were communities already depopulated by poverty, migration, and war. The absence of young men created what sociologists now call widow economies, towns sustained by state pensions, not productivity. It's a society of funerals and remittances, said sociologist Alexandra Arkhipova. The living depend on the dead. The demographic scars will last decades. Economists predict that by 2040, Russia's working-age population could shrink by nearly 20%, crippling its ability to fund pensions and maintain its armed forces. This generational burden, as The Economist called it, will haunt any post-war reconstruction. A country can rebuild infrastructure, but not the lost time of a generation. Even within Russia's power structures, unease was growing. Leaked reports from the Security Council reviewed by Medusa showed fears that loss of technical expertise poses greater long-term risk than battlefield casualties. That assessment echoed what many Western analysts were already saying. The real collapse of Russia was not economic, it was cognitive. Donald Trump's administration, while focused on preventing nuclear escalation, quietly intensified visa programs for Russian defectors in key industries. Washington saw an opportunity to weaken Putin not through sanctions, but through absorption of his human capital. Every defector with a degree is a blow to his war machine, a U.S. official told the New York Times in December 2025. The policy, controversial in Europe, nevertheless worked. Applications to American universities and tech firms from Russian citizens rose 240% within 6 months. Meanwhile, those left behind faced a cultural suffocation. Intellectual spaces, bookstores, online forums, and theaters were either closed or repurposed into patriotic education centers. Dissent no longer required words. Silence was enough. One viral post on Telegram summed up the despair. The loudest sound in Russia today is people leaving. As 2026 began, the Kremlin claimed stability. Putin's speeches still invoked pride, sovereignty, and victory, but beneath the stage lights, his empire was hollowing out. The country that once boasted of conquering space could now barely produce its own microchips. Its soldiers were dying abroad, its factories rusting, its thinkers vanishing. The war had begun as a geopolitical gamble. It ended as demographic suicide. What Russia was losing was not territory, but time, its most irreplaceable resource. And as its future drained away, one truth became undeniable: no nation, however mighty, can survive when its brightest minds choose exile over obedience. Russia's collapse in 2025-2026 is not a single event, but a multi-layered implosion: economic, social, political, and demographic. Putin's seizure of $55 billion from oligarchs revealed a regime devouring itself to stay alive. The war transformed Russia into a fortress of fear, where loyalty replaced innovation, propaganda replaced productivity, and death replaced development. From the Sochi illusion to the brain drain exodus, every phase of Putin's resilience narrative concealed a deeper fragility. The poor and ethnic minorities carried the human cost, the oligarchs lost their wealth, and the intellectual class fled. Factories turned silent, funeral homes expanded, and the Kremlin clung to illusion while the nation aged into irrelevance. In the end, the question is not whether Russia can win the war, but whether it can survive its consequences. The wounds of inequality, repression, and demographic decline will outlast any ceasefire. The Kremlin may hold its borders, but it is losing its people, its engineers, its thinkers, its future. And that may be Putin's most irreversible defeat.